Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 27th of January 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, back behind the technical desk, is Mike Robinson. And we're going to be joined live by Skype link with Alex Thompson from Eastern Approaches in Holland, who will be reporting from Holland. Before we get there, the weather, of course, pretty appalling in Plymouth. Certainly overnight, a raging gale, torrential rain, the river's all pretty high. Rain across the country, apart from Rhyl, it appears, where the sun has allegedly been sighted. So that's where people should be heading now for a few rays. Southeast London, also rain and windy. Well, where should we start? Obviously, if it's cold, chilly and wet, we're going to need some electricity to help us through our working day at least. Over to you, I think, Mike.
Yeah, well, I think we're not going to have electricity for too much longer. Been warning about this for quite a long time now, that the fact that we are not investing in infrastructure, we're allowing the power companies to not invest in the infrastructure that they're supposed to be managing. And this is a report from the Institute of Mechanical Engineers. It's called Engineering the UK Electricity Gap. And they're saying that Britain has neither the resources nor enough people with the right skills to build the number of power plants that are required to meet the difference between when our current power infrastructure reaches end of life and the new generation of power stations that we need in order to maintain our generating capacity. Now, Jennifer Baxter, who's the head of the of Energy and Environment at the Institute of Mechanical Engineers, and she is the main author of this report, said the UK is facing an electricity supply crisis as the UK population rises, and with greater use of electricity in transport and heating, it's almost certain that electricity demand is going to rise. However, with little or no focus on reducing electricity demand, the retirement of the majority of the country's ageing nuclear fleet, recent proposals to phase out coal-fired power stations by 2025, and the cut in renewable energy subsidies, the UK is on course to produce even less electricity than it does at the moment. Now, as I say, we've been talking about this for a long time, and the question is, what is going on here? One or two possible scenarios, perhaps. One is that the government is incompetent, and I realise that many people would agree with that statement, but I actually don't believe that. Or the long-term policy is based on an assessment of the UK's population that perhaps we're not being told about at the moment, Brian.
Well, it is remarkable, isn't it, that the government, and I agree, this is not incompetence, there's something much more sinister going on, can simply sit back and watch the decline of very important strategic infrastructure, the electricity generating infrastructure. We know that there's a problem coming, but you just sit and wait for that problem to happen. Or alternatively, they know that we're not going to need that electricity because there's going to be no manufacturing demand in this country to pull on it. So what's left can be heating your kettle in the morning. I'm going to use the word treason here because to reduce the country to blackouts as a result of your failure to invest in the infrastructure, you know there's a problem. This is treason.
I can't agree more. Wonder, has Alex got anything to say to that?
One rather old-fashioned word that we got from the French language, sabotage. I believe that's the technical definition of deliberately putting a spanner in the works of the infrastructure.
Well, thank you for that. I'm happy to accept sabotage as the actions of a treasonous bunch of politicians. But of course, what is important? What are the politicians debating at the moment? Well, it's nothing to do with deaths in the NHS. It's nothing to do with the demise of Britain's armed forces or the electricity supply or anything of that nature. The most important topic for debate by Scottish members of Parliament is incest. And a number of people flagged up this remarkable story MSPs to debate bid to legalise incest between consenting adults. And here they are in the Scottish Parliament for this debate. And this story has been reported everywhere. Of course, the BBC quick to say that, well, they've thrown out the petition on legalising adult incest. And then there's at least a 3-page article all about incest and why an individual is calling for changes in the law to make it acceptable. But if you read the stories, it's remarkable because it all comes back to a man who lives in Australia, who apparently claims to have almost written a book on the topic. But the strange thing is that none of the papers, none of the media outlets, not even the BBC, put a picture of this man. He is a man who lives in Australia, who apparently has the power to get a debate in Scottish Parliament. Well, here's a bit more from the Independent. Scottish Parliament has to consider legalising incest due to a loophole in the devolution agreement. And if we have a look at a bit of the text for this one, here's the man, Mr. Morris, said the current block on adult consenting incest was based on bigotry. He's apparently written that public fears, prejudice and bigotry about incest are mostly due to ignorance. And that's been created over many years, mostly by the church and church-influenced governments and newspapers. So the problem is us. It's our fears, our prejudice and our bigotry. Mr. Morris, but we don't know who Mr. Morris is. So this is the question. Who is Mr. Morris and why is he getting so much media coverage in his views? Well, on it goes. Members of the Scottish Parliament, this was the Scotsman's report to consider abhorrent call to legalise incest. We reckon what's going on here is that they're considering this abhorrent subject from an unknown man in Australia in order to nudge the British public towards considering incest as normal. And I'll just pass back to Alex on this one. There is something remarkable. This is a story across all the mainstream media, Alex. No background to it.
No, that's the strange thing, Brian. And in constitutional terms, Holyrood, yes, it's called a parliament. The Act of 1999 begins with that famous phrase, "There shall be a Scottish Parliament," which Donald Dewar wanted carved in stone as his legacy. But it operates within constitutional boundaries. There's a lot of debate in Scotland. David could talk about it as well, but I have some of the books on it, on what the powers are of the Scottish Parliament, how it sits constitutionally, and indeed whether Scotland is reinventing its constitution in these years around 2000, 2010. But it has to operate within a constitutional framework. And as we know in Westminster debate terms, powers that are not explicitly granted to Holyrood are reserved to Westminster. That implies to me that we need to go looking down the path of who in Westminster explicitly granted the power to Scotland to debate this. Because in EU terms, this would be called, using that usual euphemism, family policy. And it's usually the very last thing to be surrendered up to a higher level. So the fact that it's gone down to Holyrood implies to me that someone has sought legal advice and has been told, yes, Holyrood has been granted powers to do this by Westminster. Either that, or Holyrood is making a bid for it without actually having constitutional cover. By the way, incest-pushing stories are very common in Germany, and the sexualization of children and families is something that Germany's always taken a lead on since 100 years ago. A core piece of cultural Marxism.
Okay, Alex, thank you for that. Well, without knowing exactly what you were going to say, I just thought we'd cover very quickly these two stories. We've got Exaro here that is basically taking all the eyes off paedophile activity in Westminster and the establishment, and it's focusing on the BBC. This is the inquiry by, or the report by retired Judge Dame Janet Smith. And apparently there's now a big spat because she interviewed a DJ who was to be kept anonymous about the rape of a 15-year-old girl who then committed suicide. But apparently the DJ's lawyers are suspicious that the judge is now going to publish information which she took from him in confidence. But of course, the other thing we learn is the whole BBC report was leaked to Exaro anyway. Exaro then splashes it out, weakens the whole thing, or nudges it into the public domain. So I'm highly suspicious as to what's going on here, highly suspicious as to what Exaro is, because of course the men behind it are extremely wealthy corporatists. But I'm not the only one who's suspicious. Somebody sent us in this very interesting email. It said, "Hi Brian, interesting storyline being developed on Emmerdale at present. It involves child abuse and features one of the younger characters who's just revealed his father raped him as a child, starting when he was 8 years old. The father has been confronted, but it's suggested that it's all in the son's mind and the son is suffering from false memory syndrome." So what the person is saying here is this is all about to use primetime TV propaganda to sow seeds of doubt in people's minds about the reliability of the testimonies of real victims. And I think this person was Julian who sent this to me. I think Julian is seeing something very real. Isn't it remarkable that we can have a debate on incest, but we can't have a real debate on child abuse and a look at all the evidence that's brought it in, that has been brought forward. Mike, perhaps the House of Lords will do something on this particular subject of child abuse.
I would doubt it. But here we've got a BBC article in their magazine, a point of view, who should sit in the House of Lords. And of course, this is once again another one of these Lords reform type articles that we've seen so many of in the last year or two, because the House of Lords being unelected, it's completely undemocratic, or so we're told. So what I just wanted to do was to highlight this from the Constitution Unit, and it's nice to be able to highlight something from the Constitution Unit that sort of works in our favour for a change. But this is a webpage they've set up which lists every act of Parliament where the House of Lords has defeated the government in a vote. So it might be an amendment to an act of Parliament or so on, something that the government didn't want included, where the House of Lords has acted in against the government's wishes. And of course, this is really why the government wants House of Lords reform. They don't want an elected second chamber which would act in opposition to them or would act as a limitation on their powers. They want an elected second chamber which will be whipped just as they are and totally compliant. So let's just have a look at this. This is the this session. This is the list of. I'm not going to go through them because it would take too long. But this is the list of times that the House of Lords has voted against the government. And if we look at the next one, I think this is from 2006. And the list is even longer as we go through it. So what I've speeded this up just to give an impression. The point I really want to make here is the House of Lords serves a role as it stands. It is supposed to act as a limit on the House of Commons, and if it's replaced with an elected second chamber which is whipped, just as the House of Commons is whipped, we actually do ourselves a disservice. What do you think, Brian?
Well, I think that's the case, and I think it's why we've seen Blair's government, Brown's government, David Cameron's government all continuing to attack the House of Lords because they haven't got it totally under control. They've stuffed it with people that are for government policy, but they haven't quite broken it down as an independent debating chamber. Yeah. I think they're going to continue to keep going on it.
Yes. Now, shortly, I'm quite sure we'll say something about the EU referendum PSYOP, and I think that this is a related issue because, of course, there have been a couple of articles appearing in the mainstream press denigrating the British Empire, and of course, this is part of the big spat that's going on at the moment relating to the statue of Cecil Rhodes at Oxford University, and I think, we do not want to applaud the actions of the British Empire. I'm not going to sit here and defend empire or defend colonialism. We've got to separate that issue from what's going on with this story. So the Independent saying this is as a result of a YouGov poll, which found that 42% of Britons think that the empire was a great thing, and saying that only 16 or 17%, if I remember rightly, thought it wasn't a great thing, and the rest were undecided. The Independent telling us, showing us some of the worst crimes of the empire over the years, the Mau Mau uprising, the Amritsar massacre, and so on, and the Boer War, and so on. And the Guardian got in on the act as well. So I just want to reiterate, I'm not defending empire or defending colonialism, because there were a lot of atrocities committed, a lot of natural resources stolen, and so on. But nonetheless, this whole debate that's going on, this whole discussion that's going on around the empire, isn't really looking at it in any kind of rational way. It's attempting to hype up people's feelings on the issue, and it's part of the EU referendum psyop, in my opinion.
Alex, would you like to comment on that?
I agree with Mike at a philosophical level, certainly. The important thing about colonialism is human nature being what it is, then a people with a more advanced state of material culture and technology are, whatever their religion or philosophy, going to find a justification, a self-serving one, for occupying much more primitive people, materially speaking, although they may be spiritually far better off. And if it hadn't been Western countries, it would have been other ones, countries I very much respect in some ways, such as China, Russia, Iran. But it wouldn't have been a pretty sight, seeing those countries colonized. It wouldn't have been much better off for them. The legacy we're left with is that the whole world understands English. I'm a translator and interpreter. I'm always the first to say not everyone understands English fluently, otherwise I'd be out of a job. But thank God that's the situation. We have communication across boundaries. The whole world is able to understand each other with only 2 or 3 legal systems. English common law is a huge and growing input into many people's legal systems. These are the long-term fruits of colonialism. And if you're going on about colonialism now, in the 3rd generation after Britain actually had any colonies, then the only reason for it is because you want to replace the current legacy with a one-world government, as far as I can see it.
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons that we should be suspicious of our own government is connections to the whole of the web-based industry, and Google must be top of the list for that. So a Mail story here, picking up on what they've investigated before, but the incredibly close links between Google and Downing Street that quite rightly go back decades. In this article, though, is a quote from Cameron's former advisor, Mr. Hilton, and he warns, regardless of who's in office, the same people are in power. It's a democracy in name only, operating on behalf of a tiny elite, no matter the electoral outcome. So I'm just going to add to that, the real issue is who controls our politicians, and it's very interesting that buried in this quite long article is that quote from Steve Hilton. If we just build up a picture of what the article shows, well, of course, central is David Cameron, who's had this long-standing relationship with Eric Schmidt, former Google chief executive, and Mr. Schmidt brought in to be business and economic policy advisor. Well, presumably he's going to want policy which is pro his own business. Here's Steve Hilton, former policy guru for, that should be David Cameron, an extra T crept in there. Of course, he was godfather to Cameron's son, Ivan, so a nice little relationship there. But Steve Hilton married to Rachel Whetstone, former vice president global communications for Google. So Google buried in there again. And of course, she was former director of communications with Tory Michael Howard. But Dave's been at the wedding of Naomi Gummer, Google executive on public policy, whatever that means. And Tim Chatwin, former head of Cameron's strategic comms, leaves David Cameron, and where does he go? Well, surprise, surprise, he pops up in Google. And then this is really the key bit, that Chancellor, an old school chum of David Cameron, has just been fixing Google's tax in a £130 million deal. So I think the Mail's analysis is pretty accurate, that who's really controlling who in this little incestuous relationship. Perhaps this is what the members of Scottish Parliament should be discussing, is incest between Cameron's government and big business. Alex, over to you.
Yes, I saw someone in the chat box made exactly the same comment a second before you did, Brian. It is political incest. There's one chap in there that I have a sneaking admiration for to some extent, and that's Steve Hilton, because he speaks truth to power. Okay, well, he's not powerless himself. He's part of the power set. But he's identified that we have a democracy in name only. There's one other who's in that category and at the top rank of public life in Britain in public policy making, and that's Dominic Cummings. I believe we're going to come on to him later. But when these men speak, it's in order to signal that even they, buried in the power system as they are unhappy with the degree of chicanery going on, and that should really set alarm bells ringing. If even someone as wealthy and well connected and comfortably off in all ways as Mr. Hilton and indeed Mr. Cummings says, we can't go on running public service like this, then really it must be thoroughly broken.
Thank you for that. Well, if we're worried about Cameron, we've still got to be worried about this despicable man, Mr. Blair, who's still being paraded to give us views on what he thinks. This is the latest one. He told France's Europe 1 radio the consequences of leaving the EU will be extremely serious for the UK, not only in terms of Europe, but also internally. And he added, in my opinion, if the UK votes to leave Europe, Scotland will vote to leave the UK. What Blair seems to be saying here is that the plan is to destroy the UK if we dare to vote to leave the EU. Mike, we discussed this briefly before coming on air, but you can read this a number of ways, but he certainly seems to be threatening the country if we vote the wrong way.
It absolutely looks that way, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, here's the other man, Cameron, the iceberg that could sink David Cameron's plans to keep Britain in Europe. Sorry, that's one of yours, Alex.
Yes. The main thing about this, Brian, is if people go and read that article, I cannot see what the iceberg is. The whole piece is so befuddled that I cannot actually make out what it is. I think the whole point of this piece is just there to say, oh dear, David Cameron is trying to keep us in Europe and something is going to foil him. And I really reached the stage where I think that Mike's Twitter tag, the EU referendum PSYOP, is the only way of understanding what's going on, because I cannot make head or tail of this piece.
Well, dragging people's minds into a sort of mud where they can't see what they're being told, they can't make a decision. We had a quote about this, which is sort of leads people into feeling powerless to challenge what's going on. You've picked up on another one here from Breitbart. Outrageous Labour MP claims World War II soldiers fought for the European project.
Yes, he's there with a fellow politician in the studio who does a double take when Mr. Lammy, who used to be Labour's minister, or was it shadow minister at the time? I think he was even minister in the Blair government for constitutional affairs, and he's a Harvard lawyer by training, right? So this is the kind of quality of MP we've got. He comes on this programme and says, on behalf of his role for the Stay in the EU project, campaign, I beg your pardon, that there were all these Indian soldiers in the Commonwealth regiments of the British Army in World War II, and for all that they were fighting outside Europe and everything, he says, well, they were fighting for the European project. And his fellow political guest in the studio does a double take and says, did you just say they were fighting for the European project? He cannot believe that the guy is that off mark. And Lammy also says that 1 million Indians died in the Second World War. Now, much as we treasure the Commonwealth contribution and the blood that was spilt in both world wars, that's off by a factor of 20.
Right. So we've got to say, is this just crass bad reporting, or is something else at work here? I'll bring in this one to add a bit to the debate, as it were, but we've got The Guardian. Mindfulness, the craze sweeping through schools is now at a university near you. Now, this is a totally disingenuous headline, because this is no craze. This is a policy which is producing this mind manipulation coming through schools and universities. And of course, it's Cambridge itself which is pushing this out. The Department of Psychiatry closely involved with it. We looked at it like this. What is going on here is a nudge. So the article says that, well, there's a big problem with increased mental health problems. Here we are, increased from just under 8,000 in 2008-9 to 18,000 in 2012-13. So apparently all of the teenagers are now mentally ill. Well, what's the solution? We're going to bring in a mindful student study, a mindfulness at schools, a mindfulness at universities. Nobody talks about the risk of the interfering with youngsters' minds. And if you go to the Mindfulness in Schools project, which is obviously playing around with a lot of money, it's not clear who's actually funding this. But if you take a look at these people, you've got 2 school teachers come out of nowhere apparently running it. Well, I'm not sure I believe that. But then in the background, we've got, well, not the background, Board of Trustees, Andrew Seth, former chairman, Lever Brothers UK. And if you want to get in a bit deeper, we've got Sir Anthony Selden, former historic advisor to the government, head of Wellington School, and great man on politics. I think that this is very dangerous. I think it is an attempt to get into the minds of every single child, whether it's at primary, secondary school, or later at university. And this is psychological nudging. I don't know whether you know any of these particular people, Alex.
Yes, one of them has just leaped out at me, and that's the second from top, Fergus Crowe. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Winston's Wish. Now, Winston's Wish, of course, is a charity for terminally ill and dying children. So I'm not going to impugn his intentions. He may feel that mindfulness helps his wards, those sick and dying children, to get rid of worries. But I have to say, as a Christian, and many people of many philosophical convictions will agree with me on this, whatever they are, that you do not serve a dying person, whether they're 8 or 80 years old, by telling them to forget everything. That is not how you serve a dying person. You serve a dying person by helping them to reconcile themselves to their mortality and what they're facing in eternity. You do not help them by telling them to focus on nothing with a capital N. It's a wicked disservice.
Right, and this just shows that once we just start taking the lid off these organisations, looking at the people, we can discover quite a lot. Okay, well, let's switch to migration. Hot topic, Mike.
A hot topic indeed. Alex sent this through. I'm just going to introduce it here. Basically, this is a report from the United Nations. Replacement migration, is it a solution to declining and aging populations? And the introduction said, United Nations projections indicate that over the next 50 years, the populations of virtually all countries of Europe, as well as Japan, will face population decline and population aging. The new challenges of declining and aging populations will require comprehensive reassessments of many established policies and programs, including those relating to international migration. Focusing on these 2 striking and critical population trends, the report considers replacement migration for 8 low fertility countries: France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Republic of Korea, Russian Federation, United Kingdom, United States, and 2 regions, Europe and the European Union. Replacement migration refers to the international migration that a country would need to offset population decline and population aging resulting from low fertility and mortality rates. They don't seem to, Alex, they don't seem to go into any explanation of why this alleged population decline is happening in the first place.
No, they don't, Mike. And this is the whole thing about UN documents. It's something I'm peripherally involved in as an interpreter. And you do see international organization stuff in a different light when you're an interpreter or otherwise peripherally involved. But I have to say this. The European Union is the day-to-day, month-to-month arm of the coming global government. And to that extent, you can understand that even some honourable things are discussed in it because, you know, it is now the main forum where questions about energy and transport and stuff that affects us is discussed. But the UN is anterior and superior to it, and it has incredibly long timescales. The United Nations itself was set up a long time before the EU, and in embryo it goes back to the League of Nations. And if you look at the date of the press release on that report you just had on population replacement, it's 2000. So it was being planned through the 1990s before the Schengen Agreement in the EU on the free movement of people. So there was a plan to replace populations before there was a mechanism, even at the lower level of the EU. It just shows that the UN bureaucrats plan for things that are never going to happen during their own lifetimes, certainly not during their own careers.
You wanted to highlight this article, Rural Germany, an integration laboratory for refugees.
It's a shocker, Mike. The Local is an international franchise that tells English-speaking expatriate workers what the news is. If they can't, I'm going to be cynical here, if they can't be bothered to learn the local language and read the news for themselves. But here is The Local in Germany, largely for British workers in Germany. And what's being quoted here is this harebrained scheme, apparently cooked up in all sincerity by a couple of German elite types, to turn a particular region of Eastern Thuringia in the former German Democratic Republic, that's deep in old East Germany, into an integration laboratory for refugees. And self-congratulatingly, these elite people tell themselves and tell The Local, well, you see, there's no way to hide in the Thuringian countryside. By the way, I've been there quite a lot. It is a very, very German and a very deprived part of Germany. There's just old white people, and there's nothing there, really, apart from villages, farms, and even them they're being depopulated. But they seem to congratulate themselves with this idea, well, there's no way to hide, they're going to have to integrate. And they use this German elite expression, there are no parallel societies there, which is the same clause that the Germans use to defend compulsory government schooling, by the way, and the ban on homeschooling. So it's all of a piece, really. The German elite sincerely believes that it is able to replace the population, and that these people who are coming in from Eritrea, countries of that nature, are going to turn into Thuringians. Maybe next year they'll be queuing up at the Bockwurst stand for a pork sausage. I doubt it, though.
Sorry, I've forgotten what this one was.
Yes, this is Der Spiegel, faced with the impalatable reality that Eastern European, well, Central European political leaders are fed up with German political correctness. The title there is Flüchtlingspolitik, Osteuropäer verhöhnen politische Korrektheit der Deutschen. Refugee policy, Eastern Europeans mock the political correctness of the Germans. And the main piece that the Spiegel has picked up here is that the Slovak Prime Minister, Robert Fico, has said that he almost feels sorry for the refugees, migrants, whatever they are, coming through his country on their way to Germany, because he says they've been turned almost into a protected species in Germany. And when he says that, you realize that you're getting quite close to the understanding in Central Europe, the Visegrad bloc, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, the countries that are actually interested in sovereignty and national future. They're close to realizing that these people being funneled into Germany are being farmed. They are livestock. They're not masters of their own destiny.
A big part of what the whole basis of that UN report was that populations are declining, and they're declining not just in Europe. They were highlighting Europe as being one of the areas of decline, but in the States, population decline is a problem as well. And here we've got a report from earlier in January discussing West Virginia, which at the time this was reported, some other news outlets were saying that if you take the rate of population decline in West Virginia on a global basis, it comes third after Venezuela or something along those. That was the implications of what they were saying. So we are seeing population decline as well as an aging average age as well. So this is undoubtedly a problem, but we've got this type of thing going on as well. You wanted to highlight this from Patrick Henningsen, the use of the Zika virus, a call for a no-child policy. So this is only going to make the situation even worse.
I'm gobsmacked, Mike. I mean, I'm quite cynical, as you know, but when I read, and I went to the Washington Post article, I haven't had time to track down the original quotes in Spanish from El Salvador, but you've got Central American governments here, quoted by the Washington Post, saying, we are advising mothers who would like to have children not to have any children for at least a year because of the scare stories of this virus. And this is the first time in recorded history that any government has abused the trust that its people have put in it by appointing it there to defend its law and defend the national interest and customs by telling the population that put it there in the first place, you must not have any children until further notice. Even if it's dressed up as health advice, it is utterly wicked.
So, but at the end of the day, what we're doing is through policy, we're seeing population decline, and through that policy, then we're advising that we bring people in from other regions to compensate for that.
Yes, and the thing about this Zika strain of the virus is that it is tipped by those who seem to know all about it. It seems very much like what happened in Africa in previous trial runs, but now it's the Americas. We're told that Zika will reach the extremities of both Americas with the exception of Chile and Canada. So the cool extremes of both continents. Isn't that interesting? Canada's already been stuffed with some of these unintegratable migrants, and Chile is one of these bolt holes that seem to be strategically placed around the globe. New Zealand is another, for those in the know to run to cool, temperate places where most of this madness is never going to reach. Chile comes a bit later on in the show as well when we talk about Merkel, but it's very interesting to whenever you get into health scares and plague, questions of plague and decimation, you need to look at the families and the territories that are not affected by these pandemics. That tells you something about who's behind them.
Okay, thank you for that, Alex. Well, this headline, I'm going to say, just made me laugh. I can't put it any other way. BBC News here, commenting for one thing, Putin is corrupt, says the US Treasury. Everything I read about the US Treasury is that the whole machinery is utterly rotten and corrupt. But no, we're back on the subject of let's blame Putin. Has my cynicism got on top of me today, Alex? I just find this outrageous.
Even Russians, particularly Muscovites, who are not generally pro-Putin, have been shocked that the US Treasury would come out with such a thing. The Russians are incredibly intelligent people, particularly in financial and economic affairs. And they know jolly well that the way in which the world economy is being run on a worthless dollar is completely corrupt, and how the US Treasury, through various armed agencies, sends its agents extraterritorially to Thailand and who knows where to pick people up for charges in the US, allegedly against the US because of certain bank transactions. So, no, it's only had the effect of uniting even the critical thinkers in Russia against the US Treasury.
Okay. And we've got some pretty forceful language from Putin here talking about Saudi Arabia.
Well, allegedly, but this is the point. Here's my challenge to the people behind this this site. AWD News, I think they're called, if I'm not mistaken. It was an eye-popping headline I came across the other day. President Putin is quoted as saying Russia will bomb Saudi Arabia back to the Stone Age unless Riyadh desists from supporting terrorism. Well, first thing I notice as a translator is it's not a native English speaker. The Stone Age life is a typical, largely Slavic language fault that people make when writing in English. Secondly, I see that the article is misleading. Well, so happens often in the British and American press as well, because there's no quote from Putin saying bomb Saudi Arabia back to the Stone Age. There is a plausible-looking quote from Peskov, his press secretary, saying the Saudis are trying to maintain their corrupt way of life and their terribly backward ways by projecting force onto other countries. Then I start looking on YouTube and in the Russian newspapers whose websites are quoted in Russian to see what Peskov said, and he doesn't appear to have held such a press conference. The news that they're relying on is just absent. It's Nezavisimaya Gazeta, Independent Press, is the newspaper title that's quoted. But neither through that website nor through a search on Peskov from the last week can I find anything on it. This isn't the first time I've seen pseudo-news. I'm going to call them out and call it bogus news, which masquerades as alternative news for Putin supporters, really, to mislead them. There was a case a couple of weeks ago, actually, the beginning of this year, where the Turkish, if I remember correctly, Deputy Prime Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu was quoted as saying, "We and our allies can flatten Russia in a week." Again, one of these stonking headlines, and then you go looking for the stuff in Turkish, it's not there. He never said it.
Right. Well, of course, Mike has been warning about the computer generation of news, which is now spreading, and we see in our own newspapers in particular that we've got increasingly young journalists who are not even given the money to go out and do proper investigative journalism. So we need to review news very seriously whenever possible. Well, if Putin's back in the spotlight as the bad guy, let's just remind ourselves of that Telegraph article talking about the former MI5 man coming forward to say, yes, Britain was there when people were being tortured. And we'd highlighted that, of course, the evidence was to be heard in private. And the paper said much will never be made public because we're just the public. We're not bright enough to understand what the government is doing. And in any case, if David Cameron is doing something, he's clearly doing it to protect us. But I thought I'd just bring in this comment here from Annie Macon, herself a MI5 operative. And in this very interesting little article, she says that when she was working for MI5 in the 1990s, she said, certainly my colleagues wouldn't have condoned torture. And something has obviously happened that now means that we've been dragged in with what she regards as a brutish American overreaction to a worldwide event. So people might like to go and have a look at that. But what are we seeing in Britain? We're seeing an increasingly authoritarian state. And I think you would say, Alex, that that's also creeping into to France. And you picked up on this Telegraph article.
I'm not quite sure what the authoress's qualifications are for writing a political analysis of this kind, but it seems to be a case of the old trick. If your government is developing in a certain way at home, then you point to an old rival and say, look, they're doing the same things that we're actually guilty of at home, so to deflect attention. And so this piece maunders on about authoritarianism in France, that the security services are not reviewed properly, that their oversight is post hoc, so they do their operations and then try to justify them retrospectively instead of having independent people say beforehand, hang on, this operation doesn't fit, it's not lawful. So it's a question of really projecting onto the French everything that we're guilty of ourselves. To be fair, I would also say it highlights correctly a kind of hypocrisy as well, that when the US Patriot Act came out at the beginning of this new millennium, the French stood on their high horse of universal defence of human rights, a term that French invented, really, and said that you're breaching universal human rights. But France was known even then to be doing quite the same things as the US Patriot Act is doing.
Right. Well, somebody in the chat box has said France is still under a state of emergency, and you've picked up on a story here from the Echo.
Yep.
3 month. What is this? A prolonging by 3 months of the?
It's the old. We just talked about the comparison between the US Patriot Act and the French. Here's an example. It's the old 3 month rollover. And of course, at least Patriot Act supposedly has some kind of sunset clause, or some of its provisions do. Not so this French state of emergency, because it was done by amending the Constitution, Article 6. And all the president has to do is issue a decree, to use American parlance, an executive order every 3 months saying, that's it, another 3 months of suspension of liberties because we're in a state of emergency. Holland has been decent enough to say, dear French people, this is going to go on just as long as I see necessary until the last ISIS fighter in the world has been defeated. In other words, it's a deliberately impossible target. So a state of emergency is the new normal in France. And I agree with Mike, and I think David says it more particularly, that the US Constitution is not superior to ours in this respect, because in a presidential or president-takes-all system, the big man can sign anything he wants, and he can even circumvent judges and parliament by calling it an executive order. We don't have that in Britain, although we do have abuse of the royal prerogative by Parliament. It just shows that we actually invented checks and balances and the separation of powers, not the French Enlightenment.
Well, Alex, we can probably say that's the reason why we've got David Cameron chipping away at all that at the moment with his attacks on, for example, the House of Lords. But this is the other thing going on in UK, which is, as far as we're concerned, is a self-created terror threat. So local newspaper, the Herald, says 4 Cornwall schools evacuated amid coordinated security threat. But what's been going on here is that the British government has been pushing the prevent strategy through schools. And we've got police officers telling us that in their opinion, this strategy is creating a very fearful environment. People are spying on each other, reporting, and particularly children, What happened here? Well, schools in Penzance, St Ives and Truro were all called with a chilling warning. Look at the language in this story. We're all called with a chilling warning at around 8 a.m. This was actually January the 26th, so we're talking yesterday. There's no details. Now, that might have been withheld because it was supposedly a terrorist threat. But then in the article, there's this. London, 4 schools were also evacuated after suspicious devices. Malicious communications. West Midlands, a further 6 schools were reportedly evacuated. And similar threats were made at 4 different schools in the Black Country. So apparently we're in the midst of terrorist threats to all of Britain's schools. But these threats are so severe, we can't actually give you any detail of who's been doing what. But it's amazing they've popped up just after the Prevent strategy has been out speaking to all the teachers and school children. This is self-created, Alex. Well, that's my opinion.
I really can't imagine, even if we go by the government's narrative of Islamism, that Penzance and St Ives are full of children of Islamic heritage who've been radicalised. I mean, you know Cornwall a lot better than I do. You go there regularly. It's just across the Tamar from you. But there are no non-whites to speak of, certainly not in the west end of the county. It seems very much a case of wish fulfilment or self-fulfilling prophecies. If you go and tell a bunch of primary school children that there's this nasty thing called terrorism and even children can be involved in it, some of them are going to go home and think, "Coo, that sounds like a good ruse."
I think that's exactly what's going on, and we know that immigrant families in Cornwall are in fact very well integrated and very relaxed with the environment. And it was only a few months ago that we were talking on the subject of immigration down in Cornwall, and there was great interest from some of the migrant community. So yes, there's something suspicious going on. Where does it lead? Well, perhaps we get a clue from the Herald here, because the other thing going on in UK at the moment is something very strange with coroners. So coroners are being integrated into NHS hospitals. We know that we're now starting to see death certificates with no proper cause of death, and very often they're not signed at all. Doctors are being paid bonuses to encourage cremation. What does that do? Well, it gets rid of any evidence, of course. And we've now got coroners not being independent, but they've got staff who are exclusively ex-police, and indeed they're working alongside police. So we think something very, very sinister is coming in, and of course Cameron's bringing it in by the back door. Somebody picked it up here. So this was tweeted out, and it's a quote from Adolf Hitler. "The best way to take control over a people and control them utterly is to take a little of their freedom at a time, to erode rights by 1,000 tiny and almost imperceptible reductions." So at least on the alternative networks, people are starting to see what Cameron is bringing in. Holland's getting serious in the same way, because I believe the Dutch police are now giving you a visit if you've been posting anything you shouldn't. So this article you picked up here was anti-refugee posts. I don't know what an anti-refugee post is, but apparently it's if you criticise the Dutch government.
Well, the chap's tweet, which is embedded in there, and I went and followed it and had a look at the Dutch original and had a look at his whole Twitter feed, simply said, what a bad idea that the college, which is the, as it were, the cabinet within the local council of my town of Sliedrecht, wants to have 250 of these asylum seekers. And then he used a hashtag, Kom in Verzet, which is difficult to translate, something like stand up against this, or form a resistance. It's a loaded term. It relates to the Dutch resistance of the Second World War against Nazism as well. But in any case, he wasn't even saying come and join this protest at place X, time Y. He was just saying resist this, protest it, whatever you want, however you want to translate it. He posted that in the morning, and I have to say he looks like a bit of a wally, to be frank. He lives with his mum, and he sends out a lot of garbage in his Twitter feed. But be that as it may, there's nothing remotely illegal or inciting about it. And by the morning's end, his mum has had a bang on the door, and she says, "They're on the way to your office now, darling." So the first thing this tells me is that the population register is bad news, because all the police need to do is search on hashtags they don't like or that they've been told from on high are politically unacceptable, And then they can, by looking up your name and where you say you're living, immediately find your registered address. Thank God we don't quite have that in Britain, at least not openly, but police can just invent their own powers if you're not careful. You need to have very strict limits on their capabilities, and particularly in the Netherlands now, we're coming up for 100 years that the police and the public prosecutor have a monopoly of prosecutions. You cannot prosecute in the Netherlands, and you don't get a jury anyway, but you can't initiate a case. You have to wait for the police and the public prosecutors to carry it on, and they may suspend it at any time. So it's very dangerous, I'm afraid. The Dutch police regard themselves. I've had a policeman in the house who told me the same. He said, "We're the best in Europe, the best pupil in the class." He said, "You know, we behave, we respect everyone's human rights. We're very gentle with how we treat people." Reality is rather different.
Okay, serious stuff. Alex, you're just going to end with a little bit of comment on this book.
This is Das erste Leben der Angela M., the first life of Angela M., and this is the continental manner of not revealing someone's surname, so it's a kind of allusion to a police file. This is how a police file would look if it was released to the public. And as you can see from the cover shot there, the German journalist who wrote this wanted it to look like a police inquiry. It came out in 2013, it's not been translated into English, and in a nutshell, it shows us that Angela Merkel and her very, very quiet husband were so favoured in the East German regime, although she was a pastor's daughter, that they were given this rare privilege of owning passports and belonging to the travelling class at the top of society who were actually allowed to leave the country. They were trusted to come back and to say no ill about communism while they were away. And her handlers, who were named here, including de Maizière, who was, I think, the deputy premier at the end of the DDR period, are quoted in his book as saying, you know, this one is so good, we need to turn her into a long-term asset. It appears very much that those who say she was a KGB asset, and there are some in the alternative media community, are a bit off the mark. I know that the KGB used the Stasi at arm's length for some jobs, including in Britain, outside London, where they weren't allowed to go by gentleman's agreement. But even so, the Stasi was distinct from the KGB, and she seems to have been a Stasi asset. And she seems to have been told at the end of the communist period to remain a sleeper until such time as she could rise to national political prominence. That's the case that this book makes.
Right. Okay, Alex, thank you very much for that. Well, whatever we're seeing happen in UK, we're seeing it certainly happening through countries in Europe. The big question now is the EU referendum PSYOP. We've been given a heads up that the European movement is going to be launching its campaign, We Must Stay in Europe, around the fact that if Britain were to leave, or the claim that if Britain were to leave, we would lose 3 million jobs, to which UK column says utter rubbish. But that's the core of the propaganda about to be spewed out by the European movement and, of course, funded by the European Union itself. And as Alex has just said, well, European Union, one giant stepping stone towards world government. Okay, that's it for today. Thank you very much for joining us. We will be back at same time tomorrow. And a big thank you to everyone who's continued to support the UK column. If you're not a subscriber, please consider doing so. Thank you very much to all the people who have donated. And in the coming days, we will have some very good news about what the future holds for the UK column. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.